Good afternoon and welcome to you all. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Barry Nielsen, the Chief Customer Officer here at Nucleus. And I'm delighted to say that today we kick off our 7th year of Illuminate live events, which were originally conceived as a way for us to connect with our community with brilliant speakers that offer new perspectives, new ideas, and most importantly, arm you all with practical tools you can use to help grow and improve your business. When we plan these events, we don't always have a theme in mind. It's more about finding a variety of great speakers that can educate and inform, rather than just try and sell to you. However, we often find that over that process, we drift towards a common thread, be it consciously or unconsciously. And I think it's apparent when looking at the lineup we have over the next 4 weeks, that we've gravitated towards a series of subjects that are very much purpose-driven, all focusing on topics that will either help you improve and evolve your business, but also demonstrating the wider positive impact that the financial planning community can have, which is possibly not surprising given everything that we've all experienced over the last year or so. So on to today's event, I'm hugely delighted to introduce Lee Robertson, who is joining us as our guest host over the next 4 weeks. A chartered wealth manager, Lee is currently CEO of Octo Members Group, which he founded in 2018 to bring the financial planning industry together and provide a safe space for people to connect and engage. They now have over 2,500 members and they're growing rapidly to become the biggest community of financial professionals in the UK. Lee's a regular contributor to our Illuminate online event. He regularly writes articles for our Illuminate website. They're always interesting, and Lee is genuinely one of the nicest guys in our industry. So Lee, over to you.
Thanks, Barry. I'm blushing already. Really looking forward today. Really pleased to be here. Delighted to host this whole series of 4 events. When I was asked, I was so happy to contribute. I mean, I'm a big fan of Nucleus and particularly of Illuminate and what it does in terms of sharing knowledge, sharing best practice, helping advisors find a way forward. And coming from that community, I always found that whole Illuminate piece such an engaging piece and so helpful. So really chuffed to be involved. Before I hand over to today's speaker, Kathryn Knowles, there's the usual couple of housekeeping notes for you all. You'll have had the chance to get involved and ask Kathryn's questions during the event. Please do keep those questions coming. In 30 years of being an advisor, I've never known advisors be shy at coming forward, so let's not make that today. You've all got a chat box to the right of the screen where you can type your questions in. If you're watching us in full screen, you may need to come out of that screen so you can type them in. If you're still seeing a register button, please click on that, put your name and email address in and click on the speech bubble section. You'll then be able to type in your questions and comments. You'll also be able to see other questions being asked, and you have the opportunity to vote for those of you who'd like me to put those questions to Kathryn. Even if you don't have questions to ask, please do put in your details to ensure that we can send you your post-event materials, including your ever-important CPD certificate. And if you do experience any problems during the event, please drop a note to events@nucleusfinancial.com and the events team will get right back to you. So now on to the good stuff and today's speaker. Kathryn Knowles is Managing Director at Cura Financial Services, which is a specialist insurance broker known for insuring the uninsurable. Spurred on by our own experience and barriers to insurance, Kathryn has built a company dedicated to improving access for all. Vulnerable client policies have rightly become a priority for financial planning firms in recent years, but we know that many advisors are keen for more support around vulnerability and all the attaching topics. Not only in how to identify who may be vulnerable, but how to approach this with clients and how best to support them. Kathryn's here today to help you know when to take a different approach with clients, and she's got some great advice on what that approach should be. Kathryn, over to you.
Hi there, and thank you for having me, and thank you for that introduction as well. So, hello everybody, I am Kathryn Knowles. So, the first things first is to go through, I'm not really a slides person, but I do have some slides, so I'm going to try and obviously speak far more than having you guys read things, but first things first is just to go over the learning objectives for today. So when we are chatting, what I'm going to be hoping to do is to help you to identify some of the factors that could mean that somebody is vulnerable. I think a really important thing to be aware of when we're talking about vulnerability is that we do need to be aware of these factors, but we shouldn't be assuming that someone is vulnerable just because of certain tick boxes. And I will go through some of those in a bit. There's also the concept of analysing the wording that you're using, how to develop the soft skills so that you can support people and make them much more comfortable when they are chatting to you, and then hopefully getting to an even stronger building of rapport so that you can really truly help and identify those needs that they have. I'll be chatting a little bit about how to create a vulnerable client policy. It may be something that you already have in your organisation or something that you are looking to include. Either way, hopefully I'll be able to give you some tips there to bring some support. And then also I'll be chatting about the concept of signposting as well. Now, whether or not that's signposting to someone else in terms of you feel there's another area of advice that isn't your specialism to give support, or potentially as well, if you maybe think that there's potentially some sort of support maybe from charities that could potentially come into play as well. So the first thing that I'm hoping to do is to change everybody's minds in a sense about what a vulnerable client is. And I hope that this slide will maybe be a little bit hard hitting in some ways, really very much to the point of looking at those red words of weakened or damaged. So I work in protection insurance. So in that space, I am, from the traditional terminology, I am an impaired life. And that is something that I significantly detest being referred to or known as, very much so because it means that I'm damaged, and I'm not damaged at all. Give you a bit of background about me as to why I would be classed as that, is that I have hypermobility syndrome. It means that I am bendier than probably most of you. And it also means, whilst that can be a bit of a fun contortionism for parties, it does mean that I can more easily potentially have a break or a sprain at times. I also was left wonderfully by my third child after pregnancy. I was left with an underactive thyroid. I also have a fast heart, which obviously I'm just going to keep naming lots of things here as to why I'm maybe somebody that a lot of people would think possibly couldn't get insurance. I have a fast heart in the sense of the fact that if I exercise or I get stressed, it just starts going a bit quicker than it should do, but completely checked out. There's nothing wrong with it. It just likes to go faster. And I've also had generalized anxiety disorder for the last 15 years. And good while ago, I had 2 bouts of agoraphobia, which are not a fun thing to experience. I'm also, as I say, going back to what I was saying about the hypermobility syndrome, touch wood, it's not something I've had since my teens. It's very much based upon a hormonal kind of event that happens. So obviously puberty is a big thing. But I'm somebody who's obviously experienced quite a few fractures and sprains across quite a lot of the different parts of my body. So on paper, and speaking to you, I do not appear to be the healthiest of people. But when it comes down to it, especially if I was looking at something like life insurance, there's not really anything there that's an issue. You know, it's lots of things, but it's not really an issue. But something I would really like to point out is the fact that I have a PhD in business management. I have a husband and 3 children. My boys are aged 3, 6, and 9. And I'm also a multi-award-winning protection advisor. I run a company that employs 23 people, and I regularly consult for insurers, professional bodies, reinsurers, and trade bodies. So when it comes down to it, I am a vulnerable client potentially, but my health doesn't define me, and it has certainly not stopped me from being good at what I do and for achieving quite a lot. I think I've done all right. So what does make somebody more vulnerable? There's quite a few things that can potentially make somebody more vulnerable. If you're looking at the FCA statement, you can see it there, but just to read it out, it's a vulnerable customer is anybody due to their personal circumstances is potentially susceptible to detriments when a firm has not acted appropriately. So there are kind of 4 key areas there. I mean, the statement there from the FCA obviously is good, it's all encompassing, but it doesn't really give you the nitty gritty as to sort of like what is a vulnerable client and when do you really need to step in and provide some more advice. So I'm looking at health conditions. I've already said one there, mental health. You know, it's something where you could absolutely see a vulnerability, but you shouldn't always assume that it's a vulnerability. Somebody can have anxiety and depression, and you may think, well, they're quite, or stress, you know, work-related stress. You can maybe think, well, they're quite a kind of standardized, kind of normal. Quite a lot of people experience those things. So you may not consider them as vulnerable. And then you may come across someone who's got bipolar disorder or schizophrenia and automatically be thinking, hang on a minute, this person's, they've got a stronger mental health condition. They clearly must be vulnerable. I must make note of this. But really, that assumption shouldn't be there. Somebody with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, assuming that they are taking their medication, assuming that they are taking the sort of advice from their medical practitioners, could well be less vulnerable than somebody who is experiencing work-related stress. Because the work-related stress doesn't, it kind of sounds normal. It kind of sounds like something we all experience. So it doesn't feel like it's something that's really standing out. But for that person, work-related stress could be something that has become an immediate shock to them, and that's something that they really do need support straight away, because they've not had, with the stronger mental health conditions, they've usually had many years worth of support from people to help them know how to cope with things and how to adjust if something happens, or to be aware of their symptoms and then seek help straight away. And sometimes you can have a much stronger vulnerability for somebody who's never had any kind of mental health history, because of the fact that they don't know what to do. They don't know what they're experiencing. They may not even notice the symptoms. And they could actually end up going into potentially a much stronger, vulnerable place than somebody else. You have conditions like Parkinson's, where there is potentially a clear vulnerability. But again, we shouldn't assume, because just because somebody has Parkinson's with a neurological condition, it doesn't mean that they can't understand their financial matters and that they can't make their decisions. It really comes down to you being an individual advisor, looking at that person as an individual to sort of check those kind of, is that understanding of the conversations that you're having. Is this person understanding what I'm saying? Are they able to, when we speak, when they're repeating it back to me, are they understanding what I'm trying to say to them? Have they took it in? The next time I see them, am I having to repeat myself quite a few times? So there's different things to look out for, because as well with something like Parkinson's, at some point, it's likely to lead towards something like dementia, which is, of course, something where you would maybe need to, at some stage, consider possibly an advocate coming in. And again, that's a completely different level of vulnerability, trying to ask somebody if you feel that maybe an advocate could be useful, and something that you would need to approach very, very sensitively. You may have somebody who has had a cancer diagnosis. And again, that would potentially mean that somebody's quite vulnerable in terms of their health, leading on to their mental health, and the financial shocks that would come with that as well. And really, a recent diagnosis of anything. So if somebody's come to you and they've said that, they've recently been diagnosed with cancer, or, they recently had a stroke, or maybe even for them, it could be something, again, that some of us might think is quite a light condition, something like irritable bowel syndrome. It could well be for that person that's actually making them feel very, very vulnerable. We need to be aware that as we're chatting to them, as we're going forward with things, that we are supporting as much as possible. But I'm not going to focus just on health, because I know I do very much come from a health side of things. But there were just some examples to give you all. But there can be personal circumstances as well that we need to be aware of. One of the biggest ones that we may come across is language barriers. We have lots of people that we speak to where English isn't their first language. And it's really important that we make sure that we have different things in place to be able to help. That could be that you ask for an interpreter. It could be that you ask for, again, an advocate or trusted family member to act as an interpreter as you are chatting. But there are different things that you can do as well, because obviously one of the things we always want to do is have clients to be fully able to understand our recommendation reports and the reports of the documents that are being provided by our providers. And there are ways that you can put things in place to help with some kind of interpretation translation services with them. A big thing for me that always stands out with vulnerability when we used to be part of a network is a client's age. We had it where at one stage, anybody that we spoke to, a client that was the age of 70 or over, we had to have a written letter from that person to let us to sort of confirm to our compliance oversight that they were of sound mind. Now, I know quite a few 70-year-olds that would find that incredibly insulting. And that's why I'm saying let's not go by tick boxes. There were plenty of 70-year-olds who are absolutely not vulnerable in their understanding of situations. You can get people in their 40s who are vulnerable. I do feel that we need to move away from this. Let's just tick a box vulnerability and start looking at each person individually. There are lots of things when it comes to family circumstances as well. So somebody could have a new child. There could be a potential vulnerability there in terms of, well, how are we going to be able to protect that child going forward if something happens to this person, to the client you're speaking to? How are we going to be able to make sure that we make ends meet now that there's an extra mouth to feed and everything else that comes with having an extra child? There could also be the death or terminal illness of a partner or child, at which point there is very, very sensitive conversations to be had and probably catch-ups. We want to make sure that that person's okay, to make sure, in a sense, from our own responsibility, not just as an advisor, but as a person, that when we're speaking to somebody, that we're not just leaving them if we know that they are in a very, very vulnerable place. We want to be maybe either keeping in touch with them ourselves on a regular basis or signposting them to people who can do that and provide much more of a kind of bereavement and counselling support than we need to do. Because as well, something I will say is that it's very, very, you need to be very careful if you do identify vulnerability, that you don't become somebody that the client relies upon. You need to make sure you don't go into that kind of counsellor or too much of a support role. You need to make sure that there is still that distinction, and it's a very, very fine balance to have. Another aspect of the family circumstances would be potentially the domestic and financial abuse. So that would be something where, obviously, if you maybe only ever speak to one of the clients in a couple, or maybe even between, children to parents, that you maybe just think, well, hang on a minute, maybe I need to just make sure that I speak to this person as well. I want to make sure that everything's okay. And making sure that that there's good reason for what is being suggested. So as an example, we had one recently with somebody, and one of my team contacted me specifically and did what I'll speak about later, is they flagged the case into our vulnerable client register, which then automatically came to me to review. And straight away, it was all to do with, obviously, insurance-wise, insurable interests. And what it was is that my mother had come to us because her child has very severe autism, to the point where they wouldn't be able to communicate with us, and wanted to have some life insurance in place potentially for funeral expenses. And it's kind of like comes into that play with that conversation as well. I know some people will be thinking, well, hang on a minute, should we be doing this? Because we can't speak to this client, we can't speak to this person. But at the same point, there is a vulnerability there. There's a financial vulnerability there for that mother. And it wasn't like she was asking for hundreds of thousands of pounds, which would absolutely be a flag in the vulnerable clients types of things. She just wanted a little bit to make sure that if something was to happen, that everything would be okay. And then, as I say, you also have the things such as the financial abuse. And this is where we need to be very careful, again, with vulnerability. And I'm not going to say that financial abuse is not my key area. There are other people who are very much specialists in that. But key things that we need to be looking out for and be careful about is, as I say, whether or not we're only just speaking to one person in the family, in that couple. Does the other person know what's happening? Do we maybe want to have both of their email addresses so that if we're doing correspondence, that both people are being updated so that that person knows exactly what cover is and isn't being in place, or, as I say, get them on the phone together? There are plenty of different things that stand out for that. And in the insurance world, especially when it comes down to things like trusts, that would be incredibly important, because it could be as well that the people get divorced. And then it's making sure that both parties are equally taken care of. And also, as well, as I'm sure some people will have experienced, if there's a bit of a nasty divorce happening, that changes that need to happen in these documents, these legal documents, are able to be made without a kind of continued level of power and dominance being placed upon one party of the family. Other aspects of financial vulnerability are things like the notification of potential redundancy. This is something that we have seen quite a lot in this past year with everything that's happened. We've had lots of people come to us for unemployment cover. Unfortunately, in our space, and obviously the insurance side of things, unemployment cover was stopped for all new entrants very quickly after the COVID crisis started last year. So there was that vulnerability of people coming to us saying that they needed this cover. And then obviously, unfortunately, there was nothing really that could be done. But that's something really important to take on board as well. There's also aspects like if somebody's been ill off work, they're being able to reintegrate after being time away. So when you're speaking to people and you're offering them advice, it's not just the advice in terms of CSA, I do insurance. I'm sure there's plenty of people here who do pensions and wealth and other things as well. It's making sure that all of those things are safe. So if you're working in a situation where you're doing a lot to do with the client's pensions or wealth, then what's really key is making sure that that income is protected as well, so that we can make sure that what the plans are going to continue if this person isn't able to carry on working, or potentially, say, helping them to find services that would support them to reintegrate back into work. I'm sure we've all heard of the term of presenteeism, where people are struggling and really forcing themselves to go to work, making themselves particularly ill by trying to not face redundancy. And that in itself can become like a big spiral in terms of physical and mental health. And it's important to try and, I think that the key thing is the active listening. Really listen to your client. We're not just talking about one aspect, we're talking about all the different aspects, all those financial touch points that could potentially be something that's a trigger for them. And especially if there's something like a lack of employee support benefits. So, hopefully a lot of people have access to maybe life insurance or income protection, maybe critical illness cover through their employer. But I'm sure there are far more people who don't have those things. And it's identifying the vulnerabilities that we see now and identifying those vulnerabilities that we see in the future as well. So what you can potentially do then as we're going forward, as I've said before, never make assumptions. Just because somebody has a vulnerable trait, it really doesn't mean that they are. I would be incredibly insulted if somebody referred to me as an impaired life. And I think a big thing that stands out for me as well is this concept that if you're not prepared to say it, if you wouldn't be prepared to say it to my face that you think I'm impaired or something along those lines, then we shouldn't be using that terminology within our industry anyway. It's also really important, I think, as I say, don't make assumptions, but also give yourself a bit of a break. There are going to be times that you maybe say the wrong words or maybe make an assumption, and it's okay, to learn from them. And I think what's important is to own up to it as well. So there are times when you maybe speak to somebody, you maybe use the wrong word. Stop yourself, just say, I'm incredibly sorry that I just used that word. That's completely, I just got that wrong. Please, I hope you can forgive me for saying it that way. I'd much rather say it in these kind of terms. Is that okay? And most of the time, people are quite understanding because they've already heard those words so many times before, but they've never had anybody own up to it and actually admit that, I shouldn't be saying it that way, and I'm really sorry. The main things are to really be aware and to try and do better and to make sure that you are supporting your clients from the first step. So what you want to be doing is just always trying to sort of do that next stage. What have I learned from this time? What can I do next time? No matter what, you should still really be offering advice, even if somebody's vulnerable. If you can provide that person advice, then don't just shy away and not advise them because they have a potential vulnerability, because there's risk potentially if you advise someone who's vulnerable. There's also very clear risk if you don't advise them and you leave them going away with nothing when you could have done something to support them. Because ultimately as well, I imagine a lot of people here aren't medical professionals. So whilst you may assume a vulnerable trait and what it means, you actually probably don't know for definite. And you certainly won't know how somebody's situation is affecting them specifically. And it is never okay to leave somebody without support. It's really important to make sure that if you can't do something, or if you can't do something because you're not comfortable doing something, that's also okay. Sometimes things are outside of our comfort zone. Or it may be that you've reached a barrier based upon what you're able to do due to your regulations or to the providers that you're able to access and different things like that. Send them somewhere else. Find someone, a trusted colleague that you can send them to for those extra bits that you're not able to do. There's absolutely no shame in saying to somebody, my specialism is here. We're going a little bit into another specialism here. I want to get an expert. And what you'll tend to find is that the client really appreciates that and trusts you even more because you've admitted where your advice ends. And you've sort of like said, right, these are my limits. And I'm going to be strong enough to say that I have a limit and this person over here can do a better job on this side of things. So some potential things to do then, as you can see, some bullet points there. So the tone, when you are speaking to somebody who's vulnerable, the last thing you want to do is to be using the voice that I'm using with you guys now. Obviously, I have quite a I think I have quite a powerful voice in some ways, and I speak probably quite quickly, and different things that I do. I use, lots of different words, and probably some technical insurance words. I'll probably use some jargon type words as well sometimes. But what you really need to do is to kind of step back and make sure that you start to use a nicer tone. You want to make sure that you slow down a bit. You don't want to be insulting or condescending, but you can probably see from my face as well that I'm starting to use a slightly different approach. My eyes have become softer, my voice has become softer. I'm smiling and I'm trying to engage with my eyes quite a lot so that you know that I have full attention on you and that you are my absolute priority. And I hope from that you can see how my voice changed quite a bit. I was speaking to them as if I was speaking to a loved one who was facing quite a difficult time. It may be difficult to do. You might feel a little bit silly doing it at first. You may want to try it with a friend or your partner, just to sort of like see if you can do it without feeling as if you're being strange. And that's fine. But again, if that's not something that you feel right to do, then that's also fine. But speak to somebody who can. You want to make sure that you avoid certain words as well. So some basic words to really avoid as well is the term suffer. So especially if you were talking, about, I use this as a really good example in health conditions because it's very easy to see how the connotations of that are with health conditions. So two really big ones are saying to somebody, like I would maybe say to somebody in the insurance world, how long have you suffered with HIV? Now, obviously, very clearly, I wouldn't say that because that's not what you would do. That's not how you would term it. You would say, how long have you been living with HIV? It's a very, very slight change, but it works with any condition. How long have you been living with this? And it changes it from a negative tone to a positive tone because they are living, and we're not talking and focusing on the fact that they have something that could potentially be seen as I said earlier, something that makes them damaged or weakened. When it comes to mental health, we really need to avoid things like the terms commit suicide. That takes it back to the old days where legally committing suicide was seen as a crime. What we do instead is we say attempt suicide. Those are the kinds of things where I say you may sometimes get it wrong. You may make a mistake, but it's just important to learn. And to also thank the person when you're speaking to them if they're being open about things. I imagine for a lot of people here probably don't go into the health condition side of things like I do. But that still applies to other things, in a sense of, how long have you been suffering from debt? There's ways that we can change that. And again, debt is obviously something that's not seen as a positive. That's understandable. But our terminology changes the way that a client will feel about us when we're advising them and how open they will feel about being able to discuss all aspects with you. And a really big thing as well is if you did speak to somebody and it was to do with any vulnerability, is to really focus on listening, but maybe repeat back to them what they have said, just to make sure that you've understood it fully and how they intended it, but to try and ask them not to repeat themselves. You don't want them to have to keep repeating and reliving what they are trying to share with you. And I mentioned before as well, there's a potential for advocates. So it's quite tricky asking people for advocates. And sometimes, as I say, if somebody is outside of your compliance allowances, sort of like age, and they're saying, well, you need to have an advocate present, and that person is fully sound of mind, it can be very, very difficult. But again, when you're using the right tone and the right language, that can make things like this much easier. And you can change it to a certain way as well. So instead of saying, I need to have an advocate or family member present, to make sure that you understand what's going on, you just change it to say, what I would really like to do is have a family member or trusted friend of yours present, because just in case something happens, then as well as me knowing what's going on, that person can really step in and help you just to get things moving forward. Some other examples that I come across that you may find interesting, I find them interesting, especially as I'm going to be going back to health, so I do apologise, but it's something that you may just, even if you don't do insurances that require health type things, these are good to know just for generally if you're speaking to somebody anyway. So for something as an example like fibromyalgia, that's one where quite a lot of people seem to have it, and my mum has it, and it's one where it's a pain condition. So you may find that somebody comes and meets you, and it's our kind of social customs to shake hands with people, obviously not COVID times, but generally it's to shake hands with people. Somebody with fibromyalgia could find that incredibly painful and will actively not go to shake your hand. And that's a really difficult one to do because they in themselves feel embarrassed and rude because they're not shaking hands, because we are, dictated to shake hands and be polite. And it could feel really abrupt to you as well, and like quite rude as well, because you're thinking, why isn't this person shaking my hands? And it's really important, if you're experiencing something like that, to try and change your mindset, to think, is there a reason for this? I shouldn't make assumptions, maybe there's a reason, and a very, very valid reason for that. And they may share that with you, they may not. But I think it's, as in, I would say, general in society, is becoming much more aware of these kinds of things in all situations as to why people maybe don't react in certain ways. With mental health, you may find that somebody's not able to look at you. Possibly the same for some neurological conditions like autism. Just because somebody has autism doesn't mean that they can't engage and be involved in the different things that you'll be recommending and advising on. But, it could be a potential that, especially if you're meeting in person, that they have noticeable movements in the sense, and they may be unable to sit down for long, they may be getting up and down quite a bit, which could be quite unusual for you to see and to adjusting to. But the important thing is for you to just carry on doing what you do. And again, not to make assumptions about what's going on. Somebody with Parkinson's, my dad has that. So you can see why I'd like to bring the health side of things into everything. They could be visibly shaking. They might need to have things repeated, and they may need more time to take on board things. I did some research recently for a podcast I was doing, and it's an example of people who are living with dyslexia. There's 6.5 million people in the UK currently living with dyslexia that we know of. And they will possibly need longer to go through all the documents that you provided them. You may want to, depending upon how what their needs are, you may want to try and provide them with documents that are in the specific colours that they find easier to read. You may want to do a voice call or a video for them so that they're able to actually take things on board rather than having to just go through these documents, which for a lot of the time, if it gets a bit too intense, they will just walk away. And another big assumption, and again, this is a bit of an extreme one, but it does work quite a bit in my space of things, the insurance side of things. If you are speaking to somebody who's a wheelchair user, really, really important not to make assumptions. That person in the wheelchair could still be jumping out of airplanes. They could still be skiing. Just because they're in a wheelchair, it doesn't mean that they can't do the same types of things that all of us can do, and also that their needs are any different to what ours would be. So when it comes to developing a vulnerable client policy, I've got some tips. Hopefully you'll find them useful. So the first thing you want to do is develop a vulnerable client register. It really doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be a simple spreadsheet that is stored, obviously some are very securely within your systems, and somebody needs to be responsible for that. It needs to include things like the date that a vulnerability was identified, potential vulnerability was identified, the link or the reference to the client's case file, who the advisor is, who's the oversight of that to check if they do think there's a vulnerability, and then kind of like what we think the vulnerability is, and then what investigations have taken place and what needs to happen going forward. So the main thing is to get into that mindset of thinking this needs to be there. It may be that you identify a vulnerable client and actions need to happen, or it may be that you identify one, but actually it's all okay. And then it's just a matter of being aware of it. One thing that we have, but we do work obviously specifically with a lot of people who are potentially in vulnerable mental health states, is we have what's known as our SOS system. Now, this works quite well either if you're in an office, but obviously a lot of people aren't in offices at the moment, or if you are doing remotely. So we have a remote messaging system on our securely within our systems, and on one of those channels is an SOS system. So if any of us are on the phone with somebody and we feel that they are vulnerable and potentially at a risk of harm to themselves or to others, or if the person on the phone, the employee of ours, feels that they've had a conversation that's quite triggering for themselves, they can message into that, and it immediately flags to everybody, so that everybody who is involved or can see the messages, so that the whole team, if they're not engaged in a sense on the phone with a client or another organisation of some sort, then they can come in and say what needs to happen. management can step in. We can then potentially establish if there is a need to contact a GP, contact the emergency services, or start to signpost people towards a mental health charity. And I know that might seem a bit extreme and a bit different to what you would usually probably see in your lines of work, but there's no hardship in having it there. And with the way that obviously depression has increased quite significantly in the last year or so, you never know. And I think it's really, really important to have that there as just in case, because it may be a very, very different outcome on the situation, whether or not you have that there or not. You really do want to make sure that you've got enhanced compliance monitoring if you do have a vulnerable client register. So you want that person who's responsible for it. So that's the person who's going to go in, have oversight, review the situation, review phone calls if that's what's happening, review video calls if that's what's happening in emails. You possibly want to know things like, does a person have a carer? Is there lasting power of attorneys in place? And obviously, depending upon your specific requirements for your compliance oversight, anything like, as I say, are they over a specific age? And that's a flag to the compliance officer. When it comes to things like mental health, you've got the Texas idea and carers drills. So a lot of this will probably sound quite straightforward, but I think there's quite a unique situation that happens if you are faced with these situations, and a lot of the common sense and what you assume you would do can sometimes go way out the window. So the Texas drill is quite simple. So the first thing you want to do is thank the person for being so open with you and for being willing to share how they're feeling, and obviously express that you are there for them, you are there to listen to them. You can explain how you are going to be using their details to sort of say, like, obviously, really appreciate you've told me this information. What I will be doing is recording what we're saying because of this and this and this, because I'm going to be helping you by getting you X, Y, Z. You do need to make sure that you gain the explicit consent, as I'm sure we all do in our advisor roles. We always make sure we have explicit consent. But if somebody is showing a vulnerability, then we do really want to make sure that we have it very clearly recorded that they are okay for us to support them. What you possibly want to do as well in the Texas drill is to ask roughly 3 questions about things like, how are they able to manage their finances? How are they able to communicate? Do they need a family member or advocate to support them? That's obviously probably something that you won't experience often, but it's worthwhile just knowing about that. And then the last thing on the Texas drill is to signpost to the specialists. So that could be signposting to some charities that I'm going to chat about on the next slide, or it could be signposting to specialist advisors. The idea drill is slightly different in the sense that what you do is you try to understand the impact of the condition that person has upon their understanding of things and how you can advise them. They want to know, the duration of the condition. How long has it lasted for? Is this something that has been something long-term that they live with? So has that impacted upon their ability to gain finances, to put into pensions, things like that? Or is it something that's quite new, which in itself is going to be quite a shock to what is going to be happening in the sense of their financial planning going forward? They would then say the episodes, how often has this happened? And assistance, have they tried to get any kind of support at all? You then have to be careful for the carers drills. This is the one where you are maybe speaking to an advocate or family member. You need to check for the authority. Does that person have the right to act on that person's behalf? You need to avoid talking about the really specific account details unless you know for definite that they maybe have something like the lasting power of attorney, and the right one, obviously, to be talking about the finances. You want to be reassuring to the person about what you're doing. Make sure that you speak to them, be very, very clear about what you're going to be doing to helping that person. Because obviously, if they are a carer and they genuinely are caring for that person, they may be a little bit cautious about obviously what is happening financially wise. So we need to put their minds at ease just as much as the clients. Explain to them what you need to chat to the person about. Just be very clear that you're not going to be intrusive. And if you are needing to ask more in-depth questions, that you're very clear as to your reasoning as to why you're asking them. Just like with anything data protection wise, we should never be asking anything that we don't know. So that kind of encompasses all into one. And what you should be doing is recording the thoughts and observations of the carer, because they will help to inform you on the level of vulnerability and what you feel comfortable in terms of supporting people. And then summarize what's going to happen. Really important, as with anything, to always summarise and make sure that that person understands what you're saying. Maybe ask them if they can potentially repeat the process of your advice, not repeat themselves, but repeat what you're going to be doing for them to support them. And the last thing, obviously, is to protect the client and protect yourself, which is the next slide and the final slide that I'll be sharing with you. So when we're looking at signposting to support, there's a number of ways that you can do this. So professionally, what you would ideally want to do is set up a relationship with an advisor that you trust, who has a specialism different to yourself. So I do protection insurance. It's all I do. I advise out and I signpost out for pensions, private medical insurance, mortgages, investments, because it's not what I do. I understand that clients need that, and I understand where they, obviously could definitely be using support, but it's just not my area. And I will just say to people, that's not me. Go speak to this person over here. I trust them. I've worked with them a long time. Lots of ways that you can do that. If you are part of a network or something, that you may already have some specialists that have already been approved by the network that could be worth trying and seeing how you get along with, or potentially do it yourself. Another thing is obviously as well is that you could bring somebody in-house with that specific specialism, which is always a very good move to do as well. There is also as well the British Insurance Brokers Association's signposting services, where you can potentially find approved advisors there that can provide support to your clients if you're not sure exactly where to turn to. Now, when it comes to protecting yourself and also the client in terms of their actual additional support needs, so potentially their mental health needs or anything else, there's quite a few things that you can do. So the ABI have just developed some mental health training. That's also is quite similar to one that's called Talk Suicide, and they are ones that you can do. Talk Suicide is free and obviously very, very specifically focused upon quite strong aspects of mental health events. And the ABI's mental health training, I believe, is free for now. Don't quote me, but I think it's free for now, but I think eventually that will become a paid for service. You can also as well take part as an organisation or individually in specific training things with different charities like Dementia Friends. I did one of those quite recently, and I actually found that really useful because, as I say, with my dad with Parkinson's, at some point I'm probably going to be facing him experiencing dementia. And it was really interesting to hear how they actually explained it and how it then related it to me and how I can understand how his mind is maybe working a little bit more now. You've also got things as well. Now, I'm not sure if this is available in the pensions and wealth space and different spaces, but especially in the protection insurance space, there are some extras that come with some insurance policies now. It's always worth asking if that person has these policies or if their partner does, because even if they don't, if their partner has it, they can often access these services through the partner's cover. That can be access to things like Red Arc nurses, can sometimes be access to 24-hour, 7 days a week GP services, remote connections through your phone, second medical opinion services, lots of different things that can be accessed there. And it's just always worth checking if somebody has that to hand, regardless of whether or not they are vulnerable or not. You have your standard areas and your charities like Samaritans, Mind and Mental Health UK. And what I would suggest is that if you do develop a vulnerable client register and policy, is that you maybe have somewhere in your organisation that's really easy for everybody, quite centralised, to be able to quickly get to that and to get to these numbers so that they can provide somebody with support and direction if they do need that help. And then obviously there's a money and pension service to help as well in terms of any additional financial support that somebody might be needing. So that's the end of my slides. I hope it's been useful. And now we're going to the point where me and Lee are going to have a chat and hopefully answer some questions that you guys have been sending in.
Thanks, Kathryn. Really useful as ever. Lots and lots of actionable stuff in there. So you won't be surprised to hear that lots of questions have been coming in. So we're going to go straight to the questions, and please do keep them coming in. So first one from Settle Meta. Hi, Settle. Nice to see you. What are your thoughts on creating greater education for clients on vulnerability means, e.g. client-friendly material to be included in client proposition brochures or short education videos on an advisor website? Have you seen anyone doing this well?
I'm assuming you possibly mean sort of like potentially the vulnerabilities that can happen. So maybe like the income protection shocks. So if somebody's new to the income protection, there are quite a few providers who help to do sort of like risk calculators, specifically in the income protection space. So you've got LV's risk calculator, you've got Legal & General's deadline to the breadline, and the Exeter have a calculator as well. And they are really good in the sense of, I use that as part of my training materials as well for my new advisors. And I'll say to them, right, so what kind of like do we think we need? And obviously everybody initially kind of thinks insurance-wise, well, I need to have life insurance and things like that. And actually, when you look at it, it was something like my risk of death was about 5%. My risk of being unable to work for 2 months was 49%. You know, it was, and I think, you know, sometimes if we have those statistics to hand, they can be really helpful. But I think a good way of doing that is, I think it's quite hard to do it by videos sometimes if we're just giving out videos to the public, because we don't want to scaremonger. And we want to make sure that we're doing it in a very positive way. And obviously a positive way that kind of really hits home some of these things isn't necessarily hand in hand. But I think the 7 Families campaign is an incredible thing for people to go to. So the 7 Families were 7 families who suffered really significant medical shocks and events. And what happened is that a group of providers got together and essentially they paid and kind of gave them income protection for a set period of time, even though they didn't have income protection, to basically say, this is what could happen and this is what's available. And there's a website that has the case studies on there, and that's incredibly important. And it's something that we actually, anybody can access it. And we've actually pulled some of those videos into our website to just give people that kind of understanding of, this is what can sometimes happen. We don't want to be seeing that, but it is something that can happen. And I think doing stuff like that, find out the videos that have worked well. I would say don't just run into doing videos yourself. You know, if you're going to, maybe test them out a little bit with people who aren't familiar with what you're doing in your space. Make sure that you're not being too jargonful, and make sure you're not being too scary with the events that you're maybe talking about. But I think it's incredibly important that we do that. I think it's quite easy sometimes people obviously are prepared to look at life shocks. But I think it's quite easy sometimes to kind of think it's somebody over there, it's not me. And I think we are seeing more and more all the time that people are experiencing quite significant either health or financial or family circumstances. And there can be really big shocks there for people.
Okay, thank you. The final bit of that question, Kathryn, have you seen any advisors doing this particularly well?
I'd like to say me, hopefully.
That's all right.
But, you know, I think that, you know, there are a number of advisors that are obviously doing a lot of outreach in this space. You have, obviously, we do quite a bit. There's Matt Chapman does quite a lot as well. Roy McLaughlin is quite involved in this space about, especially there is signposting to talk to people about saying, look, this isn't, there's vulnerabilities here, there and everywhere. You're an advisor in that space and you can identify vulnerability there. You don't necessarily, even though you think you might know everything, you maybe don't know everything about the vulnerabilities over here. Let's make sure that we're tallying up all the vulnerabilities together and doing a full round, really good job for the clients.
Okay, thank you. Really good question here from Jennifer Jones. We were talking about health issues a second ago. One of our clients is a married couple of whom one has had a recent cancer diagnosis. They've now said they want to change their advisor, and Jennifer feels that their situation makes them vulnerable and they should take care with the decision to change advisors. How would you advise the most tactful way to approach this discussion?
Ooh, that's a bit of a difficult one, and that's not going to be easy for you guys. I think it's really hard. I mean, I know that obviously for people, I believe for people when they're diagnosed with cancer, one of the first things that they are asked is, what are your financial circumstances, you know, by the nurses, sort of saying, like, what do you have in place and different things like that. So they're already starting to maybe get some points. I think it'd be interesting to know where they're planning to go to. You know, is it somebody that's advertising themselves as particularly good for people who have had cancer? I think a big thing as well, and obviously if they are saying that, maybe you have a look at their background and make sure that what that person's saying is true. I think a big thing as well is sort of like what area we're talking about as well. So insurance wise, I would be quite concerned, because if somebody already had insurance, has developed cancer, and is then wanting to talk about with a new advisor, I'd be quite concerned thinking, well, they're wanting to change his policy because actually what they can get now is going to be nothing like what they've already got. And, you know, we really need to step in. I think, as I'm sure you probably already have done, that the only thing you can really do is be supportive and sort of say to them, okay, so what is it that you are actually, what do you think this other advisor is going to be doing that I'm not doing? Because what I want to do is just make sure you've obviously had a very, very big event happen, and I really want to support you. You've been a client for this long. I would like to stay with you because I care about how you are going to be, and I'd like to make sure that we keep in touch so that I know that you're going to be okay. Let me know what you're expecting elsewhere, and I'll let you know, obviously, if that's something that I'm going to be doing as well. Hopefully that helps a bit.
Okay, thank you. Oh, my old friend Tina Weeks has popped up a question. Hi, Tina. Would you actually say to a client that you think they are vulnerable? And Tina's thinking about the way you said about not saying something behind their back that you wouldn't say to their face. How would you kind of address that?
Yeah, I've never had a situation where I've actually said to somebody, I think you're vulnerable. I think a lot of people kind of instinctively already know it. I imagine it's possibly a bit safer and easier to say if we were talking about maybe a financial circumstance, in the sense of saying, I think there's maybe a financial vulnerability here, because it's not actually saying to that person, you are vulnerable. You're talking about the situation. You're kind of terming it within the money side of things. And whereas if it's a health, then that would be obviously much, much more difficult to sort of say. I think what I would just be doing is being very aware of it in the background myself. So when it comes to, say, like a health condition, when I'm helping people, I'm already pretty aware of a lot of the potential vulnerability points as to what that condition would potentially present. Obviously, not assuming, as I say, but I'm very aware of the tone and the language, and that lets me sort of like develop that. I was speaking to somebody very recently, and it's somebody, obviously I'm going to be very careful with my wording to make sure that it's not identifiable in any way. And it's somebody who's does have a family and two young children, and they are probably every couple of weeks or so trying to take their own life. And they came to me for support, and it's somebody who emails me, and it's quite difficult actually, because obviously you want to be there and support, but then you'll get an email all of a sudden saying, I'm back in the crisis house because I tried to end it all yesterday. And that can be quite hard. Now, I've never said to this person, you are vulnerable. I mean, that they're very open and they know that anyway. They've not said that word to me, but from the very start, I just made sure that my approach from the very start was just automatic of, so I'm going to be speaking to you and your partner, and just made sure it was done that way. So I kind of just made sure, for me, that was a very obvious thing very early on. But I think as long as you don't say from the very start that you'll only speak to them in many ways, try not to put yourself in the box, because then if something then develops later on, you can say, right, okay, well, obviously we're going to be doing this advice. And as I said before, that option to say, what I'd really like to do is have somebody join us, because, obviously if something happens, you could even go to another situation where you could potentially say to them, if something happens, if you're wanting something like lasting power of attorney in place for health matters, because in case somebody's unable to communicate, and you're talking along those kinds of lines, then you can also kind of say, well, just in case something happens and, obviously you're at a stage where you're unable to communicate or anything like that, then it's a really good idea for us to have someone else here who knows what's going on. I think in all likelihood, you're probably going to be speaking a lot of the time. I imagine most of the advisors here will be speaking to the family as a whole anyway. So you'd probably not have two people that were of really clear vulnerability. So you would have that in play both times. And then it's just a matter of, I don't think there's any sort of like particular need to sort of say you are vulnerable. I think there's definitely ways around that.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a couple more questions. We're pretty much on time, but we'll make sure we get these questions done. So Alan Dickinson Quelch has asked, he has a client who is 75 and is living with HIV. Nice use of language, Alan, as Kathryn mentioned earlier. He looked recently at an impaired life annuity, however, the rates were not improved. Is living with HIV not an impairment, and can they obtain life assurance?
Yeah, so living with HIV is not an impairment. There's a massive, massive debate about this, and it's something that our company has actually done quite a lot of changes in the life insurance space with this. So the difficulty for this client right now is his age in terms of being able to, the insurers that he can apply to. Insurers are becoming much, much better in the life insurance space. I don't do annuities, so I can't comment on that side of things, but I can just comment from the life insurance side of things. So due to COVID restrictions and things like that, it may be that there's a little bit of difficulty age-wise in getting the cover in place right now. But no, so living with HIV it's really changed in the mindsets of insurers recently. We do still have issues. Some of them will still cap the term to about 20 years, maybe a bit higher if it's linked to a mortgage. Some of them don't have a cap on the amount of years it can go for. There used to be limits on the sum assured. I'm not sure if some of them may still do that. But as an example, just before COVID started, one of my team, she was the first advisor in the UK to arrange a personal income protection policy for someone living with HIV. So we are at that stage where we are making changes. They are starting to. One of my arguments with it is that if somebody who's living with HIV, who's on the medication, who's all their figures and everything, the medical statistics are within the right ranges, they're probably far less of a risk than many other people because they get yearly medicals. So if anything is going to be happening, it's caught very, very quickly. And, so they are probably less of a risk than someone who's walking around with undiagnosed type 2 diabetes or potentially a little bit of cardiomyopathy or something. So definitely changes happening in the space, definitely starting to get a better mindset towards it. Still a good way to go. But obviously I don't do the annuity space, but if you want to have a chat about like how it works in other spaces, more than happy to.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kathryn. So final question before we get into the roundups. A really interesting, I think, practical question from James Pinkney. Thanks, James. How long would you consider a recent widow or widower as temporarily vulnerable? Is this a case by case, but it's a difficult process to judge as the grieving process will be different for all?
That is a difficult one, isn't it? I think it needs to be a case by case. Unfortunately, I don't think there's any kind of set timings with that. But I think as well, it's important to say to yourself that there's also, it depends on how often whatever your services that you're providing, the products you're providing. Obviously, some of them you'll be speaking to them annually anyway. But if you're not, then it could be something where you just want to keep in contact with them. But I think this comes down to as well, making sure that you're signposting them to these support services, to the charities that can really step in and provide advice. Maybe sort of set it up every now and then, sort of say, right, when you sort of finish the phone call, okay, so let's catch up. When should we have a catch up? Sort of let you know how long they think that they maybe can do with before having a chat. It could be at first that you're speaking to them maybe once a week or something, just having a bit of a catch up, just saying, how are you doing, and then it maybe just naturally starts to go, well, why don't we leave it a couple of weeks, and then maybe go like that until you're back into your usual routine. But again, at that point, maybe if somebody is sort of recently widowed, that you would want to maybe say to them, is there somebody that can help and join in these conversations that you trust, that can sort of like support you while we're chatting? Because then you can then make sure that there is somebody there that they are speaking to that can really step in and help them to understand, because they may not be able to follow everything that's being said to them straight away. But at the same point as well, you are an advisor, you're not a counsellor, and you need to make sure that you don't cross that line as well.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. So that's the questions. We'll begin to draw this to a close. Kathryn, a huge thank you, as ever, full of practical insights, tips and tactics. And I'd probably make a slight plug here for the Practical Protection podcast, where it's absolutely full of this kind of information. So if you're not yet listening to it, please do. But Kathryn, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Tomorrow morning, everyone, you will receive an email asking you to complete a short feedback survey to let us know what you thought of today. Once you complete the survey, you will, of course, receive your CPD certificate and a copy of Kathryn's slides and a link to every event replay should you want to watch again or share it. So thanks again, Kathryn. Thanks, everyone, for joining us and for submitting your questions. I hope to see you all back here next week. And now I'll hand back over to Barry. That
was brilliant. Thank you, Kathryn and Lee. That was a hugely insightful session. And thank you to everyone else for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the last hour with us and you got a lot out of Kathryn's session. Lee will be back at 1 p.m. next week with Richard Essex from Greyside and Jeannie Boyle from EQ Investors, where they'll be talking about another hot topic, ESG and sustainable investing. And we'll have a particular focus on how you can get closer to your clients through sustainable investing strategies. So we hope to see you all there. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you all have a really fantastic and productive week. See you soon.